I am Victor, 61 years old, and I used to believe that sacrificing everything for your children would guarantee their love and respect. I spent $130,000 renovating my son's house just to make his wife happy. In return, he banned me from my only grandson's graduation dinner via a text message claiming I was taking up too much space. I did not argue. I simply picked up the phone, stopped all the money, and put their house on the market. But that was just the very first domino to fall in a chain reaction that erased his fake lifestyle overnight. The velvet box felt heavy in my palm. I was standing beneath the bright halogen lights of an upscale jeweler in downtown Nashville, my thumb tracing slow circles over the polished wood of the display case. Nestled inside the box was a custom gold-toned pilot's watch. I had paid $3,000 for it, but the price meant nothing to me. What mattered was what was engraved on the back of the casing. For Cooper, the horizon is not the finish line. It is just the start. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories. I am glad you found your way here today. Before we go any further, drop a quick comment below if you can. Have you ever had a family member take advantage of your generosity and then act as though they were entitled to it? Just yes or no. I would love to know. I am not the only one. A quick note. Some details in this story have been shaped for storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. Love, Grandpa. Cooper is my 18-year-old grandson, and that night marked his high school graduation. I had been mapping out every detail of this celebration for more than 6 months. Back when Cooper was small, he used to climb onto my lap in the study and rattle on endlessly about aircraft engines and flight mechanics, while Gavin and Lydia sat in the adjoining room, eyes glued to their phones, not hearing a word he said. That boy was the light that kept me going after I sold off my structural engineering firm. I had the jeweler wrap the gift in forest green paper, Cooper's favorite color, always had been. Standing there at the counter, I could already see his face lighting up the moment I slid that box across the table at Crest Steakhouse. The jeweler was passing me the receipt when my phone buzzed hard against my ribs. I figured it was Cooper asking about pickup time for the ceremony. It was not. The name on the screen was Gavin. I cleaned my reading glasses on the hem of my shirt and stared at those words again, half convinced the store's bright lighting was warping what I was seeing. The message said, "Dad skipped the graduation dinner tonight at Crest Steakhouse. Lydia's family only. It is too crowded." My feet did not move. My whole body just locked up right there on the showroom floor. Every sound in that store, the soft acoustic guitar playing over the ceiling, speakers, the murmur of customers nearby, collapsed into a hollow buzz behind my ears. Lydia's family only, too crowded. My grip tightened around the forest green box until my knuckles drained of color. And then my thoughts zeroed in on Crest Steakhouse. That private dining room existed because of me. Their waiting list for event spaces ran 6 months deep. But I called in old favors from my engineering days, bypassed the queue, and locked it down. I had handed the manager my Platinum American Express card to secure the booking, and I personally signed off on the estimated $4,000 tasting menu for the whole evening. Roland and Constance, Lydia's parents, had contributed exactly nothing to any of this. They were planning to glide in, cut into premium beef, and drink the wine I was financing. And yet, here was my son informing me to stay away, so that his well-heeled in-laws could spread out more comfortably at a table I had arranged and funded. A cold clarity hit me, then sharp enough to cut. The loose threads of the past 3 months pulled tight all at once. 12 weeks back, Gavin showed up at my house agitated and restless, wearing a path in my living room carpet. He made his case for renovation. Money the suburban house needed serious work. The roof was failing, the kitchen had fallen behind the times, and he wanted Cooper's last stretch before college to be somewhere worth living in. I did not hand them a loan to repay. I absorbed the entire cost myself, $134 straight out of my liquid savings. I thought back to those contractor invoices I had rubber-stamped without a second glance. Imported quartzite countertops, a custom-built outdoor kitchen, with a built-in smoker-wide plank, white oak floors for the entire first level. Lydia had pushed hard for every premium upgrade, framing each one as a sound investment in the home's resale value. But clutching that vicious little text in the middle of that jewelry store, the real story finally came into focus. That renovation was never about Cooper's comfort or well-being. It was a backdrop. Lydia wanted the whole property transformed, so her parents would be suitably impressed when they touched down for graduation weekend. I had funded their performance start to finish, and now that the set was dressed and the dinner paid for, I was an awkward prop they needed off stage. I pushed through the jewelry store door and stepped out onto the downtown Nashville sidewalk. The sun still had some warmth to it, but everything inside me had gone to frost. I had let so much slide over the years. The way Lydia's expression would sour whenever I brought up where I came from, the modest working-class life that built everything I had. The way Gavin only picked up the phone when something broke or when a trip abroad had maxed out his budget. Each time I told myself, this is the price of fatherhood, you absorb it. You carry on, you protect the peace for your grandchildren's sake. But I was done telling myself that story. This was not some careless oversight. Gavin had timed that text with surgical precision. He sat on it until every contractor had packed up and left, until that reservation was fully secured, until graduation day itself arrived, and then he swung the door shut in my face. He expected me to pocket the insult, say nothing, and process the credit card statement at month's end without complaint. He had me filed under passive funding source, no further consideration required. I quit walking. Standing at the edge of the curb, I pulled up that message one final time. There was no point drafting some wounded, furious reply. No point ringing him up to plead for a chair at my own table. Begging for respect from someone who has already decided you have none is an exercise in humiliation. So, I went to the secure banking app instead. Past the checking, past the savings, straight into the Platinum credit card portal. For 5 years, Gavin had been an authorized user on that account. He had a card sleek metallic, his name embossed right on the front, drawing off my primary line. What started as a safety net for real emergencies had quietly become his personal tab for client dinners and high-end wardrobe updates for Lydia. I pulled up the card management section and found his name in the authorized user list. The confirmation screen gave me 2 choices, temporary freeze or permanent removal. I chose permanent removal. 3 seconds of processing and it was done. That card was now dead weight in his pocket, but I had more ground to cover. I rang the Premier Concierge line printed on the back of my card, and someone picked up before the second ring. I told them I needed fraud and disputes right away. Once the agent was on, I laid it out plainly, a hard block on any charges coming from Crest Steakhouse that evening. I would not be on the premises, and if anyone tried to run my card on file there, I was directing them to treat it as unauthorized and fraudulent. They confirmed my identity, verified the block, and that was that. I ended the call, tucked the phone away, and slipped Cooper's velvet box into the inside pocket of my jacket close to my chest. Gavin and Lydia had wanted to perform. Gracious hosts, self-made, handling a lavish evening with ease that was the image they were selling. Well, tonight that dream was theirs to keep. The private room, the long table, the whole production, all theirs. So was the $4,000 bill at the end of it. The first domino had already gone over. My son had assumed he could wring me dry and then shove me aside, but a brutal lesson was heading his way. One about what happens when you treat the hand that feeds you like a doormat. Back at home, I lowered myself into the leather chair at my office desk and let it take my weight. The house held a deep, total silence, the kind that doesn't comfort you. It just gives the anger room to harden into something slower and far more deliberate. Everything on my desk sat exactly where it belonged. The brass lamp threw a steady amber light across a set of structural blueprints I had been marking up for a former colleague. But I was not looking at any of it. My attention was fixed on the tablet glowing at the center of the desk, the secure banking portal refreshing on a 30-second loop. I glanced across at the vintage ship's wheel barometer clock mounted on the wall. 9:15. Right about now, over at Crest Steakhouse, they'd be clearing the main course plates. I could map out the scene without any effort. Roland and Constance holding court at the far end of the long oak table in the private room, swirling $300 bourbon and holding forth about their country club set, or Roland's international logistics company, without the faintest idea that the person who had arranged and paid for every bit of this was parked alone in a quiet suburban office. Gavin would be right there beside them, performing the role of a man who had it all figured out, while Lydia basked in her parents' admiration. I reached for my black coffee. It was stone cold. I drank it anyway. I was not going anywhere. I knew exactly how my son operated, and I knew what was coming next. Gavin had a ritual with restaurant bills. The moment a waiter approached carrying the leather folder, he would time his move, reaching into his wallet, with rehearsed confidence pulling out that heavy metal card without so much as glancing at the total, performing the role of generous provider for Lydia's wealthy parents. He had been polishing that act for years, and I had always been the unseen hand making it run. Not this time. The ship's wheel barometer clock on the wall chimed 9, then 9:15. Without warning, the tablet screen blinked to life with a new entry at the top of the ledger. Crest Steakhouse, Ford 250. I leaned forward, pulse steady and deliberate. The status icon beside that number showed a spinning gray wheel while the restaurant's system reached out to the bank. It turned for exactly 4 seconds. Then the text went bright crimson. Declined, unauthorized card. A grim smile settled across my face. One word on a screen, and it was the most gratifying thing I had read in years. Declined. I pictured the waiter hovering awkwardly beside the table. I pictured the color evacuating my son's face as that word was murmured discreetly in his ear. Gavin would try to write it off as a glitch. He would wave the waiter off, ask him to run it again, buying himself a few minutes to slip away and sort out the mess. Sure enough, exactly. 2 minutes later, my cell phone began rattling across the wooden desk. Gavin's name blazed up on the caller ID. I left it there. 3 rings, 4, 5. Let him sweat it out. Let the full weight of what was happening press down on him before I picked up. Just before the call dropped to voicemail, I reached over and accepted it. I held the phone to my ear and said absolutely nothing. "Dad, are you there?" Gavin's voice came through in a tight, frantic whisper. Behind him, I could make out the hollow echo of a restaurant restroom, a faucet running somewhere nearby. "Dad, answer me." "I'm here, Gavin." My voice came out flat, unhurried, a sharp contrast to the alarm bleeding through his. "What is happening with the card?" He demanded, his voice fracturing under the pressure. The waiter just ran it, and it came back declined right in front of Roland and Constance. "This is mortifying. You need to call the fraud line and get this cleared up right now. Tell them it's authorized. They are waiting at the table." "There is no fraud hold, Gavin." I measured each word out slowly, giving every syllable room to land. "The account is in good standing. Your card specifically is no longer active. I canceled it 3 hours ago." Silence on the line. I could hear his breath bouncing off the bathroom tiles. "What do you mean you canceled it? Are you serious right now? The bill is over $4,000. I don't have that sitting in my checking account, and you know that." I settled back in my chair, eyes on the crimson decline notification still glowing on the tablet screen. "I know exactly what is in your checking account, Gavin. I know you ran your personal cards dry buying tailored suits to make an impression on Roland. That is no longer my concern. You sent me a text this afternoon. You said tonight was Lydia's family only, too crowded for your own father to attend his grandson's graduation dinner." "Dad, please!" His tone shifted, the entitlement crumbling desperation seeping in underneath. "Lydia is going to lose her mind. Roland is already checking his watch. We can go over the text tomorrow. I was just overwhelmed. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. Just unlock the card so I can settle this and we can move on." "You meant every word you wrote," I said, my voice going to stone. "You wanted a curated evening with your wife's high society family. You wanted to look like you belong in their world. Here is your opportunity. Since tonight is a Lydia family-only affair, the Lydia family can cover the check. Walk back out there and ask Roland to open his wallet. He never stops talking about his sprawling logistics empire. $4,000 ought to be nothing for a man who operates at that level. Let him pay for his own prime rib." "You are doing this to punish me." Gavin's voice turned hard, the desperation burning back into anger. "You are actually trying to embarrass me in front of my wife's parents because your feelings got hurt. That is pathetic. You are a bitter old man holding my finances hostage because you can't accept that Lydia's family is better than ours." "Better than ours?" I let that phrase hang between us, let him hear the sheer audacity of it echoing back. "I paid for the roof above your head. I paid for the imported quartzite countertops Lydia absolutely had to have. I paid for the shirt on your back right now. Roland and Constance have never put a single dollar in your pocket. They just arrive, consume the wine I'm financing, and pass quiet judgment on my taste. You threw your own father overboard to impress people who wouldn't give you 5 minutes if you showed up broke. And as of tonight, Gavin, you are broke." The sound of a restroom door swinging open and shut came through the receiver. Gavin's voice dropped to almost nothing, cold and venomous. "Listen to me very carefully, Dad. If you don't turn that card back on and cover this dinner, you are finished. I mean it. Cooper's graduation ceremony is tomorrow morning at the high school stadium, and I have your VIP family pass in my hand. You humiliate me tonight, that ticket goes in the trash. You will not see Cooper walk across that stage. I will cut you out of his life completely and make sure it stays that way." There it was. He was holding my grandson over me like a club. He believed threatening my relationship with Cooper would make me fold, instantly reach back into my pocket, apologize, and go back to being the compliant father who absorbed every insult to preserve the peace. Gavin had badly miscalculated who he was dealing with. "Enjoy washing the dishes," I said quietly. I ended the call and set the phone down on the desk. It started buzzing again within 3 seconds, Gavin calling back. I picked it up, powered it off, and watched the screen go dark. He was on his own from here. He would have to walk out of that bathroom, face Roland across that table, and explain why his card had been rejected. The glossy fiction of his lifestyle had just met its first real crack. But freezing his dinner tab was the mildest thing I had planned. If he wanted to threaten me with Cooper, I was going to dismantle the very ground he was standing on. What he seemed to have forgotten was who actually held the deed to it. I pulled up the contacts on my desktop computer, scrolled past engineers and city inspectors, and stopped on the name I was looking for. I picked up the landline, the receiver, cool and solid in my hand, and dialed the number, carefully listening to each tone ring through the quiet office. 2 rings, then a crisp professional voice came on. "Summit Realty Group. Dorian speaking. What can I do for you this evening?" "Dorian, it's Victor," I said, my eyes resting on the dark face of my powered-down cell phone. "I need a listing processed immediately. Top priority. I want a full-sized for sale sign driven into the front yard by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I'm selling the house my son lives in." The morning air was cool and motionless. It was exactly 8 hours when the deep rumble of a commercial contractor's truck split the quiet of the suburban neighborhood wide open. I was sitting half a block away, watching through my windshield. Dorian had not wasted a moment. He guided 2 workers in heavy boots to back the truck up along the immaculate edge of the front lawn. They were not there to deliver appliances or drop off renovation materials. Out of the truck came a thick wooden post, painted stark white, and a heavy iron mallet. The mallet rang out down the street. Thud, thud, thud. They were driving a 6FT real estate sign deep into the perfectly manicured lawn, the same grass I had just paid to have reseeded last month. The sign was designed to be impossible to walk past. A glossy headshot of Dorian, the Summit Realty Group logo, and 3 words printed in bold red lettering across the top, "For sale." It was the kind of sign engineered to pull every passing eye. No driver on that street could miss it. The heavy thudding of the mallet accomplished exactly that. The front door of the freshly renovated house burst open, and Gavin came barreling out onto the porch. He was wearing a monogrammed terry cloth robe and holding a ceramic travel mug. He pulled up short for just a moment, eyes going wide as the enormous advertisement planted in his front yard registered in his brain. Then his expression collapsed into raw fury. He thundered down the front steps, bare feet slapping the expensive stone walkway I had paid to have laid, and launched into a tirade at the 2 workmen, ordering them off the property at once. He threw his arms around wildly sloshing hot coffee down the front of his robe. Dorian stepped forward without raising his voice, clipboard in hand, and attempted to pass Gavin the official listing notice. Gavin knocked it aside. Several houses down, neighbors drifted onto their porches. Dog walkers stopped mid-stride on the sidewalk and turned to look. Gavin noticed the audience gathering around him. He leveled a trembling finger at Dorian and the workers, shouting that they were trespassing on private property and that he was dialing the police to have them removed in handcuffs. He yanked his phone out of his robe pocket and stabbed at the emergency line. I sat in my car and watched. I made no move to stop him. I let the call go through. He was so deep inside his own constructed reality, so bulletproof in his own mind, that he genuinely believed law enforcement would show up and defend his version of events. Through the broad front window, I caught the silhouette of Roland Lydia's father drawing back the curtain to see what all the noise was about. The very humiliation Gavin had been engineering his life to avoid was now playing out live in front of his father-in-law. Fewer than 10 minutes later, a county sheriff's cruiser rolled onto the streetlights, cycling silently. 2 officers climbed out and crossed the lawn toward the commotion. Gavin rushed over, immediately casting himself as the wronged homeowner. He jabbed a finger at the for sale sign, then at Dorian, insisting these men had vandalized his property and were running some kind of fraudulent real estate scheme. He called for them to be cuffed for trespassing. That was my moment. I turned the key, eased away from the curb, and rolled slowly down the street. I pulled in directly behind the patrol car and cut the engine. I got out carrying a single brown manila envelope. I came up the driveway at a measured, unhurried pace. The moment Gavin spotted me, every drop of color left his face. The bluster he had been throwing at the officers switched off like a light. "Good morning, officers," I said, keeping my tone calm and even. "There seems to be some confusion here. I am the legal owner of this property." Gavin let out a strained, hollow laugh. "Don't pay attention to him," he told the officers. "That's my father. He's confused, having some kind of episode. My wife and I own this house. We've been here 10 years. Check the mail inside, ask any neighbor on this block." The lead officer glanced over at me, one eyebrow raised. I did not bother trading words with Gavin. I opened the manila envelope and drew out a neat stack of watermarked documents. I placed the official property deed directly in the officer's hands. "I acquired this property a decade ago through my private company Apex Holdings LLC," I said steadily as he worked through the pages. "I am the sole managing member of that entity. My son and his wife have never held ownership of a single square foot of this house. I allowed them to live here entirely rent-free for 10 years. The understanding was that they would build up savings and eventually buy me out or assume the mortgage. What they did instead was spend freely on luxury travel and designer goods, assuming they could ride that arrangement indefinitely. As of this morning, I am liquidating the asset." The officer turned to the second page, checking the state seals and the LLC registration that placed my name at the top. Then he looked up at Gavin. His expression shifted, the neutral professional face replaced by something closer to irritation. He understood now that Gavin had dragged them out here on a false trespass complaint. "Sir," the officer said to Gavin, returning the documents to me, "these papers are entirely in order. This gentleman's company is the legal owner of record. You are not the homeowner. Given that your name is not on the deed and no rent changes hands, the law would view you as a month-to-month tenant, at best possibly just a long-term occupant. He has full legal authority to list this property and post a sign on the lawn." Gavin stood motionless on the grass. The neighbors were still watching. The image he had spent years constructing, the successful executive, the proud homeowner, was fracturing in full public view beneath the morning light. He had boasted to everyone on this street about renovation upgrades and property values, all while living under my roof without paying a cent. Now the whole neighborhood had the real story. He was a grown man occupying his father's house on borrowed goodwill. "You can't do this," Gavin whispered, his voice unsteady humiliation and shock fighting for control of it. "You can't just sell the house out from under us. We have nowhere to go. Cooper's graduation is in 3 hours. Lydia's parents are standing inside watching this right now." I looked at him without a trace of sympathy. "You made it perfectly clear yesterday that I have no place in your family occasions," I said, my voice level and cold. "So I no longer have a place in your financial affairs. You wanted to stand on your own. Here is your chance. Start packing." I had barely turned toward my car when the front door swung open again. Lydia came storming out onto the porch. She was dressed for the graduation, expensive floral designer, dress hair done, every detail in place. But her face was burning with fury. She blew past the officers without a glance and came straight at me. "You are a miserable, bitter old man," she snapped, her voice carrying the full length of the street. "You think holding that deed gives you the power to throw us out. You think you're so clever. You are wrong. We are not month-to-month tenants, and this house is not yours to sell." The lead officer stepped between us, palm raised. "Ma'am, I need you to bring it down. The legal owner has every right to sell." Lydia swung her gaze toward the officer, and a sharp, victorious smile cut across her face. "He is not the only one with legal documents," she said. She pointed one manicured finger straight at my chest. "We have a signed, legally binding 5-year lease agreement on this property. It cannot be voided by a sale. The paperwork is in my safe upstairs, and I can produce it right now." She had just played her card with no idea she had handed me something far more damaging than a real estate dispute. The officer took the document from her. He produced a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and worked through the paragraphs. Gavin drifted up behind her, looking completely lost. It was plain he had never seen this document before in his life. He stared at Lydia with a muddled expression, caught between bafflement and sudden relief. Lydia did not acknowledge him. Her eyes stayed on me, chin lifted, daring me to make a move in front of the 2 officers. She was convinced she had outmaneuvered me. She believed a piece of paper was an impenetrable wall against everything her own behavior had set in motion. The officer handed the document back to Lydia and released a long, tired breath. He turned toward me and gave a slow shake of his head. "Sir," he said, his tone measured and neutral, "she has a notarized lease agreement, and it carries what appears to be your signature. Whether or not this document holds up is beyond what I can assess standing here on the lawn. As the law stands at this moment, this is a civil contract dispute. We have no authority to enforce an eviction or remove them from the premises today. You will need to bring this before the housing court." Both officers walked back to their cruiser and pulled away. Lydia let out a loud, triumphant laugh. She turned to Dorian and told him to remove his sign from her lawn before she contacted the Municipal Code Enforcement Office. Dorian looked back at me, waiting. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask to hold the document. I simply walked up to Lydia. She pulled the lease against her chest, but she wasn't fast enough to cover the bottom half. I dropped my eyes to the signature line. That signature at the bottom was supposed to be mine, but it was a clumsy, amateurish attempt. The loop on the capital A was entirely wrong, and the letter slant leaned sharply to the left. I write right-handed with precise, rigid strokes, a habit built over 4 decades of drafting engineering blueprints. The signature on that page was a blatant, panicked forgery. I held Lydia's gaze. Not a word left my mouth. I gave her one slow, cold smile. Then I signaled Dorian to leave the sign, exactly where it stood, and walked back to my car. I started the engine and pulled away from the suburban neighborhood, heading straight for the commercial district in downtown Nashville. My destination was the glass and steel high-rise housing the corporate law firm of my primary attorney, Elliot Vane. Elliot was not a family lawyer. Neighborhood disputes and emotional custody squabbles were beneath his practice. He was a corporate litigator, complex contract law, and hostile acquisitions were his territory. He was precisely the man you called when a family member crossed the line into federal fraud. I took the elevator to his corner office on the 40th floor. Law books lined every wall, and the broad windows opened onto a sweeping view of the city skyline. Elliot was behind his mahogany desk, nose deep in a corporate merger file. He looked up clearly, not expecting me without a prior appointment. I dropped into the leather chair across from him and walked him through everything that had happened on that front lawn. I described the document, the nominal $1 monthly rent written on it, and the crude forgery of my name. Elliot did not hesitate. He leaned forward, his focus sharpening immediately. He opened his laptop and pulled up the State Registry of Public Notaries. Every notary stamp carries a unique identification number tied to one specific registered individual. During the brief moment Lydia had held the document out in front of me, I had read and committed to memory the name and number on that stamp. I recited both to Elliot. He entered the information into the database and hit search. The office went quiet, nothing but the low hum of the climate system filling the room. After a few moments, the results loaded on his screen. Elliot studied the profile, eyebrows lifting slightly. He angled the laptop so I could read the registry myself. The notary stamp belonged to a woman named Nora Kellum. Her registered employer was listed directly beneath her name, a corporate address. The headquarters of Roland's International Logistics Company. The paralegal who had illegally stamped and certified that forged document worked directly for Lydia's wealthy father. Everything snapped into place. Lydia had panicked the moment she understood I was cutting them off. Without the money or the legal standing to challenge me in court, she had reached into her father's corporate infrastructure. She had almost certainly dropped the document on the desk of a compliant low-level paralegal at Roland's company, asking for a quick notary stamp as a personal favor for the boss's daughter. She assumed an official-looking seal would be enough to send the local police away and make me blink. She assumed wrong. Elliot closed the laptop. His expression had gone entirely serious. "Victor," he said, no trace of lightness in his voice, "your daughter-in-law has made a catastrophic miscalculation. Forging a signature on a lease is already serious, but taking a fraudulently notarized document out of the house and presenting it to sworn law enforcement officers to obstruct the legal sale of a multi-million-dollar property that lifts this well beyond a civil matter." I leaned back, letting the full weight of that land. "What exactly are we looking at, Elliot Morris?" "Felony title fraud," he said, reaching into his drawer for a fresh legal pad, "and use of forged instruments to deceive law enforcement. Because she employed a notary stamp registered to an interstate commerce logistics corporation, we can make a strong argument for federal jurisdiction. By trying to save her fake suburban lifestyle, she just handed us everything we need to dismantle her." Elliot picked up the pen from his desk. He did not pause to ask whether I wanted to offer her a second chance. He knew me better than that. He asked for my formal authorization to proceed with a scorched earth legal approach. I gave him one firm nod. He picked up his office phone and dialed directly into the district attorney's fraud division. He identified himself and requested to file an urgent criminal report concerning a coordinated title fraud scheme involving employees of Roland's International Logistics Company. He gave them the notary identification number and laid out the full sequence of events from that morning. I sat in the quiet office and listened to my attorney engage the machinery of the criminal justice system. Lydia had believed she was untouchable this morning. She thought that forged document was her decisive move. She had no idea that by pulling it from her safe and waving it in front of law enforcement, she had committed a major federal offense. The trap was closed. The authorities were engaged. The countdown on her manufactured reality had just reached 0. I left Elliot Vane's office building in the downtown Nashville and returned to my car. The afternoon heat pressed down hard on the pavement, but my thinking was cool and precise. Lydia believed that fabricated 5-year lease was a masterstroke her insurance policy against losing everything. But in her rush to outmaneuver me, she had completely overlooked a basic legal reality that came attached to claiming primary tenancy on a large suburban property. For the past 10 years, my company Apex Holdings had done far more than keep a roof above their heads. It had quietly absorbed every operational cost tied to the estate: the central air conditioning, the municipal water supply, the natural gas running to the custom-built outdoor kitchen, with a built-in smoker, all of it billed directly to my corporate accounts. They never once opened an envelope or logged into a payment portal. They had lived inside a sealed, consequence-free world where utilities appeared like magic every time they touched a switch. I settled into the driver's seat, ran the air conditioning, and picked up my phone. I navigated to the Municipal Utility Board website, found the direct line for the Commercial Accounts Division, and dialed. A representative answered. After a brief hold, I gave my corporate tax identification number and confirmed my identity as the sole managing member of the company. I instructed the representative that Apex Holdings was severing all financial responsibility for the property effective immediately. I directed her to remove my company as the financial guarantor on the electricity, water, and natural gas accounts. She typed for a moment. I could hear the keys through the receiver. She then told me that since there was no secondary account holder to assume the billing, the city would be required to initiate an immediate shut-off protocol. Services, she warned me, would be remotely disconnected before the end of the current business day. I told her that was exactly the outcome I wanted. I thanked her and ended the call. I checked the dashboard clock. It read 4 in the afternoon. Lydia had spent the last 3 weeks broadcasting on social media about the exclusive pre-graduation cocktail hour she was hosting that evening. She had structured the entire event around dazzling Roland and Constance before Cooper walked across the stage the next morning. She had brought in a private bartender to serve premium cocktails in the newly renovated living room. She wanted the house perfectly cooled, the custom lighting precisely dimmed, and music drifting through the rooms to frame the successful, polished life she and Gavin had supposedly built for themselves. I drove back to their neighborhood and parked 3 blocks away, tucked in the shade of a large, mature oak. I rolled the windows down and waited. I wanted a front row seat for the moment their carefully maintained illusion finally gave way to reality. At 5:30, a sleek black town car turned into the driveway. Roland and Constance stepped out in expensive evening wear and made their way to the front door. Gavin welcomed them with outstretched arms, gesturing toward the imported quartzite countertops visible through the front windows, playing the proud homeowner to perfection. The grand chandelier in the foyer blazed overhead. The house radiated warmth and wealth, every light burning, every surface gleaming. I watched the clock on the dashboard tick forward. 5:45, 5:50, 5:55. At exactly 6 hours. In the evening, the municipal utility grid executed the automated disconnect order. It happened all at once. The towering crystal chandelier in the foyer went stone-cold dark. The high-end landscape lighting along the front walkway blinked out instantly. The warm ambient glow from the living room television disappeared. The steady drone of the central air conditioning unit along the side of the house shuddered and died completely. The house was swallowed whole by the creeping evening dark, a solid silhouette against the twilight. Even sitting 3 blocks away, I could feel the sudden smothering quiet that must have descended over that living room. Through the wide front windows, I watched the shapes of the people inside moving in confusion. Lydia stood clutching a silver tray of appetizers, completely motionless in the center of the room. Constance was on the expensive leather sofa, glancing around in dismay. Gavin yanked his cell phone from his pocket immediately. The cold blue glare from the screen lit up his panicked face against the darkness. I knew precisely what his first move would be. He was calling the emergency outage line for the power company, dead certain that a local transformer had blown, or a tree limb had brought down a wire somewhere. But Gavin was about to stumble onto a financial secret he had spent years desperately burying, one he especially needed to keep from his formidable father-in-law. When you ring the utility company to report an outage and learn the account has been shut down, the only path to restoring power is opening a brand new account under your own name. And opening that account means the utility company runs a hard pull on your personal social security number to verify your creditworthiness. For years, Gavin had moved through town projecting the image of a highly successful corporate vice president. He drove a leased luxury car, wore tailored suits, and handed Lydia whatever designer handbag she pointed at. But that grand salary was pure illusion. Behind the scenes, he had been funding his entire lifestyle through high-interest credit cards and predatory personal loans. He had maxed out every line of credit available to him just to maintain appearances. His debt-to-income ratio was catastrophic, and his credit score was completely wrecked. He had buried this financial wreckage deep out of sight. Terrified that Roland would find out his daughter had married a man drowning in reckless debt, I watched through the window as Gavin paced back and forth across the dark living room, with the phone pressed to his ear. I could perfectly imagine the conversation unfolding on the other end. The utility representative was pulling up his social security number and staring at a screen filled with severe credit delinquencies. Because his credit was so wrecked, the city municipal utility board would not simply restore service on trust alone. They required a steep financial penalty to cover their risk, a mandatory non-refundable security deposit of $1,500 payable immediately in cash or certified funds before they would even think about switching the electricity and water back on. Gavin stopped pacing. He went still in the middle of the dark room. His checking account was empty. His credit cards were maxed out. The authorized user card linked to my account was permanently canceled. He didn't have $1,500 to his name. Here was a supposed corporate vice president standing inside a multi-million-dollar house, unable to pay to turn his own lights on. Roland, a man who had constructed a massive international logistics empire through relentless, ruthless efficiency, rose from the leather sofa. He had no patience for incompetence, and he certainly wasn't going to sit sweltering in a hot, dark room while his ice melted. Even from my car, I could read the aggressive posture of Roland confronting his son-in-law. He jabbed his finger at Gavin, demanding to know what was taking so long. He asked why a man of his so-called professional standing couldn't handle a simple household problem. He wanted to know why the power company was refusing to restore electricity to a man who claimed to earn $250,000 a year. Gavin lowered the phone from his ear. The blue glow from the screen faded, dropping his face entirely into shadow. He had nothing to say. He couldn't blame a storm. He couldn't blame a broken line somewhere. He was caught completely crushed between the suffocating truth of his hidden financial ruin and the cold, cutting stare of the father-in-law he had thrown me away to impress. The walls of his counterfeit suburban kingdom were caving in on top of him, and I was the one who had finally cut the power. The morning sun was already scorching the asphalt when I swung into the parking lot of a quiet diner on the edge of the city. No suit today, just simple slacks and a button-down shirt. At this exact moment, I should have been seated in the front row of the high school stadium, watching my grandson collect his diploma. Instead, I was in a vinyl booth across from a man named Brent. Brent was the lead contractor I'd hired 3 months back to run the massive renovation on the suburban house. He was a tough, no-nonsense guy who had built his construction business from scratch. The kind of man who honored contracts, respected hard work, and had absolutely zero tolerance for clients who jerked him around. I ordered a black coffee and waited for the waitress to step away before sliding a thick legal folder across the table. Brent wiped his hands on a paper napkin and opened it. Inside was a formal notarized stop work order drafted by my corporate attorney earlier that morning. It officially terminated the renovation project effective immediately. Brent stared at the document, his jaw going tight. He looked up at me, eyes narrowing with open frustration. He stated that the job was 90% finished and that I still owed his firm the final installment of $40,000. He told me he had already paid his subcontractors their weekly wages and had purchased the remaining high-end materials entirely out of his own pocket. I kept my voice perfectly even. I explained that the property was now the subject of an active criminal investigation. I walked him through the forged lease and the felony title fraud my daughter-in-law had committed just the day before. I made it entirely clear that my company Apex Holdings was freezing all financial assets tied to that address until the district attorney wrapped up their investigation. Because the property was under fraudulent dispute, I could not legally authorize final payment for materials installed on a compromised site. Brent leaned back in the booth and dragged a heavy calloused hand across his face. He was angry, but he was a seasoned businessman. He understood legal liability and the risk of getting tangled up in a federal fraud case. Even so, he pointed out that $40,000 was a serious hole for a small company to absorb. He brought up specifically the custom luxury appliances Lydia had insisted on during the final design phase. There was a massive built-in panel front refrigerator, an imported 6-burner dual fuel range, and a double-wall oven system. He had delivered and positioned them in the kitchen just 2 days ago, in preparation for the graduation party. Because my final payment was supposed to cover them, they were technically still unpaid. That was precisely the opening I had been waiting for. I took a sip of my coffee and met his eyes directly. I reminded him of a very specific legal clause in the master contract he had signed with my company. I told him that because the agreement was strictly between Apex Holdings and his construction firm, my son Gavin had absolutely no legal authority over the project whatsoever. Gavin had not signed the checks. Gavin had not approved the blueprints. Gavin was nothing more than an unauthorized occupant living in the house. And under state construction law, any unattached materials or appliances delivered to a job site that have not been paid for in full remain the absolute legal property of the contractor until the final invoice is settled. I told Brent that I was not going to pay him the $40,000 today, but I was also not going to stand in his way if he drove to that house right now and legally repossessed every piece of unpaid equipment to recover his losses. A slow knowing smile worked its way across his face. He understood that I was handing him a clean legal path to recoup his money without dragging my company through civil court. He closed the folder, tucked it into his canvas work bag, and pushed up from the booth. He pulled out his phone and dialed his site foreman on the spot. He didn't bother with a goodbye. He just fired instructions into the phone, telling his crew to drop whatever they were doing and meet him at the suburban estate with 3 heavy-duty box trucks and 4 steel appliance dollies. I finished my coffee in peace, paid the bill, and drove home. I didn't follow him to the house. I didn't need to. I already knew exactly how the scene would unfold, and I wanted Gavin to face the full terror of it without me there as any kind of cushion. At 10:00 in the morning, the heavy rumble of 3 massive commercial box trucks rolled through the quiet suburban street. Gavin and Lydia were likely running on no sleep. They had spent the entire night sweating through the summer heat inside a pitch-black house, no air conditioning, no hot showers, and no way to stop their expensive party food from spoiling in a warm refrigerator. Roland and Constance had probably stayed the night trapped in that miserable, suffocating house because their pride would never allow them to slip away to a hotel and concede the evening was a complete disaster. Brent came straight up the front walkway, flanked by 6 big men in heavy work boots. He didn't touch the doorbell. He hammered his fist against the wood until Gavin wrenched the door open. Gavin looked wrecked. His expensive clothes were wrinkled and deep circles hung under his eyes. He tried to pull himself up, demanding to know what Brent was doing there and threatening to call the police for harassment. Brent just laughed straight in his face. He pulled the master contract from his bag and pressed it flat against Gavin's chest. He announced loudly that the project was terminated, the final payment was canceled, and he was there to collect his property. Gavin moved to block the doorway. He shouted that he was the homeowner and that nobody was removing a single thing from his house. Brent didn't bother arguing with a man who had no legal ground to stand on. He simply signaled his crew. 6 large men walked past Gavin as though he weren't even there. They went straight into the custom kitchen that Lydia had spent months boasting about to her country club friends. Lydia came running into the room, shrieking as the men wrapped heavy nylon moving straps around the massive built-in panel front refrigerator. Roland stood in the hallway, completely dumbfounded, watching as these blue-collar workers methodically dismantled the carefully constructed illusion of his daughter's elite life. The wiresman tilted the refrigerator back onto the steel dolly. They wheeled it right across the wide plank white oak floors out the front door, and down the driveway ramp into the waiting box truck. They didn't stop there. They came back inside for the imported 6-burner dual fuel range, then the double wall oven system, then the massive stack of uninstalled custom cabinetry stacked in the dining room. They stripped the kitchen completely bare, leaving nothing behind but gaping holes in the imported quartzite countertops and exposed gas lines jutting from the walls. Gavin ran back and forth between the front yard and the kitchen, screaming at the crew, pulling at his hair, begging them to stop. But he was utterly powerless. He had no money to pay them off and no contract to enforce. For the second time in 24 hours, the neighbors drifted out onto their front porches. They stood in absolute silence as the luxury appliances were carried out the front door in broad daylight. The wealthy, successful vice president was being stripped of his possessions in full view of the entire neighborhood. Lydia collapsed onto the front steps, sobbing uncontrollably as the last truck slammed its heavy metal door and rumbled away down the street. Gavin stood in the middle of the driveway, staring back at his dark, gutted house. He had banned me from a simple dinner, and in exchange I had taken the electricity, the appliances, and the very substance of his home right out from under him. The late afternoon sun was stretching long golden shadows across the hardwood floors of my living room. The house was completely still, a sharp contrast to the chaos I knew was consuming the other side of town. I was settled in my favorite armchair, with a glass of sweet iced tea gazing out the front window at the empty street. Despite the clean justice I had delivered to my son and his wife, a heavy ache had settled deep in my chest. There was an innocent casualty in all of this. My grandson Cooper, he had officially graduated high school today, and I had not been there to watch him cross that stage in his cap and gown. I pictured him standing in the packed stadium, scanning the sea of cheering families, spotting his parents and his wealthy other grandparents, and finding my seat empty. It broke my heart. Then a soft, hesitant knock at my front door pulled me back. I set my glass down on the side table, rose slowly, and made my way to the entryway. When I pulled open the heavy wooden door, the breath stopped in my throat. Standing on my front porch was Cooper. He was still in his dark navy graduation suit, though the jacket hung open and his tie was pulled loose around his collar. He looked utterly drained. His shoulders were hunched and his eyes were red and swollen, like he had been crying in his car on the way over. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me with an expression of profound guilt and sorrow. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a thick leather binder stamped with the local high school crest. He held it out toward me with a trembling hand. I took it carefully and opened the cover. Inside was his official high school diploma, heavy parchment paper, bearing a gold foil seal declaring his graduation. He had driven straight to my house rather than going to the lavish catered after-party Lydia had supposedly arranged at a rented country club hall, given that their own house was currently gutted. I didn't ask him why he had come. I simply stepped back and invited him inside. He walked into the foyer and looked around at my modest, quiet home, as though it were a safe harbor in the eye of a hurricane. We moved into the kitchen, and I poured him a tall glass of ice water. He sat down at the wooden table, curling both hands around the cold glass, studying the condensation for a long, quiet moment. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, but it was the safe kind. Then the truth came pouring out. Cooper looked up at me, his voice unsteady, and confessed everything. He told me he had not wanted to send that cruel text message the day before. He explained that Gavin had cornered him in his bedroom, right before they were supposed to leave for the steakhouse dinner. Gavin was in a full panic over the restaurant bill, the seating arrangements, and making the right impression on Roland and Constance. He demanded that Cooper fire off a message telling me to stay home, insisting that my presence would somehow undermine the sophisticated atmosphere Lydia was working to create. When Cooper flatly refused standing up for me and telling his father it was wrong, Gavin reached for the ugliest weapon a parent can ever pick up: pure financial blackmail. Gavin got right in his face and told Cooper that if he didn't send that exact message and keep me away from the dinner, he would cut off his college tuition entirely. He threatened to refuse to co-sign any student housing loans, threatened to drop his car insurance, and threatened to throw Cooper out of the house the moment he turned 18. Cooper was terrified. He felt completely cornered by his own father. He told me he typed those words with shaking hands, feeling as though he was betraying the one person in the family who had ever really listened to him without passing judgment. He apologized again and again, the tears finally breaking free and falling onto the wooden table. I walked over and placed my hand firmly on his shoulder. I told him he had absolutely nothing to apologize for. I told him he was the victim of a coward who had used his own child as a human shield to protect a fragile ego. But the revelations didn't end there. Cooper took a deep breath, wiped his face, and admitted something he had kept hidden from his parents for over a year. He told me he had no desire whatsoever to attend the prestigious, eye-wateringly expensive private university Gavin and Lydia had been parading to all their friends. That school had been chosen purely for its social currency, a trophy for Lydia to brandish at her country club luncheons as proof they ran with the right crowd. Cooper wanted something completely different. He brought up those quiet afternoons he had spent in my study as a small boy, completely absorbed by engine structural mechanics and the question of how things actually worked. He told me his real dream was to enroll in a specialized high-intensity aviation mechanic academy in the next state over. What I'm about to share is the moment I stopped being patient and started being permanent. The ground beneath everything Gavin had built was about to give way, and he would never see it coming. If you ever discovered that someone in your own household had been quietly working against you, would you confront them head-on or move in silence until the moment was right? He wanted to work with his hands to understand complex aircraft machinery and to build a real tangible career he could actually be proud of. He had secretly applied to the academy and been accepted months ago. But when he finally worked up the nerve to tell his parents, Gavin exploded. He dismissed the profession as blue-collar nonsense and flatly forbade him from going, terrified of what Roland and his wealthy logistics associates would think if his son became an aircraft mechanic rather than a polished corporate executive. Gavin was actively wielding the threat of pulling all tuition money to push Cooper into a life he despised, all to protect a hollow family image. I listened to every word my grandson said. A deep, clarifying sense of resolve settled over me. Gavin believed he held all the cards because he controlled the money. But Gavin was an arrogant fool who never bothered to read the fine print of his own financial life, always assuming someone else would handle the details. I left the kitchen and walked straight into my home office. I woke up my desktop computer and told Cooper to follow me. I asked him to pull up a chair right next to my desk. I opened my secure web browser and logged into my master financial portal. I didn't navigate to my checking account or my corporate holdings. I went to a specific heavily protected investment tab, a 529 college savings plan. I had opened that educational account the very week Cooper was born. For 18 years, I had quietly deposited thousands of dollars into it every single year, letting the interest compound and grow completely tax-free. The balance on the screen was well over $150,000. Gavin knew this account existed. He had always assumed that when tuition bills arrived, he would be the one to release the funds, playing the generous provider, using my money as a leash to steer his son's future. He was absolutely wrong. Because I was the original sole contributor and the primary account holder, I held complete unchallengeable authority over the plan. Cooper watched the glowing screen in stunned silence as I clicked into the Beneficiary and Administrative Settings tab. Because Cooper had officially turned 18 years old today, the state recognized him as a full legal adult. I clicked the Transfer of Administration button. Slowly and deliberately, I typed his full legal name into the primary administrator field. I entered his personal email address and cell phone number for the security verification. I transferred complete control of the entire $150,000 educational trust directly to him. I pressed the final confirm button. The screen processed for a moment, then flashed a bright green banner confirming the permanent transfer. It was done. My grandson's eyes went wide with shock as he stared at that number on the screen. I told him the money was now entirely his, legally untouchable by his father, his mother, or anyone else. He was the sole master of his own educational future. He could use those funds to cover his aviation mechanic academy in full, purchase whatever tools he needed, and secure his own housing, with plenty remaining to begin his adult life on solid footing. Gavin had tried to use financial coercion to bend his son into submission, threatening to destroy his future over a dinner reservation. But in 30 seconds, with a few clicks of a mouse, I had wiped out his only leverage entirely. Cooper was completely free, and Gavin had just permanently lost his final hostage. The small bell above the diner door chimed as someone came in. I was tucked into a corner booth, working through a plate of scrambled eggs and scrolling through emails on my phone. The diner was a modest working-class place a few towns over from my house, the kind of spot where the waitresses already know your order and refill your coffee without being asked. I needed the quiet anonymity after the emotional weight of handing Cooper that educational trust the day before. I was just about to signal for the check when a shadow fell across my table. I looked up. Standing there completely out of place among the vinyl booths and linoleum floors was Roland. He had on a custom-tailored charcoal suit, an expensive silk tie, and a gold watch that likely cost more than the diner was worth. His face was rigid jaw set with the particular tension of a man accustomed to barking orders and watching them carried out immediately. He didn't ask to sit. He simply slid into the booth across from me and set his expensive leather briefcase on the scratched Formica table. I folded my napkin and leaned back, letting him go first. He took a slow look around the diner with barely concealed disdain before his sharp, calculating eyes settled on me. He straightened his cuffs and drew a measured breath. "Victor," he began, his tone thick with condescension. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries. My daughter spent the entire night crying in a dark, sweltering house. My son-in-law apparently cannot keep the lights running, and I was forced to watch a crew of laborers haul away the kitchen appliances, while the whole neighborhood looked on like it was a public event. The graduation weekend was a complete and utter humiliation." I took a slow sip of my coffee. I didn't cut him off. I let him put every card he had face up on the table. Roland leaned forward slightly and continued. "I have no interest in whatever personal dispute you're conducting with Gavin. I don't care about your wounded feelings over a dinner invitation. What I care about is my family name. Lydia is my daughter, and the circles we move in do not absorb this kind of public embarrassment. You are making a spectacle of yourself, and it reflects on me." He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a sleek leather checkbook. He uncapped a heavy fountain pen, wrote quickly, tore the check free, and slid it across the table until it stopped in front of my coffee cup. I looked down. It was a certified bank check made out to me for $50,000. "Take the money," Roland said, his voice low and deliberate. "Think of it as a clean buyout. You'll sign the property deed over to Gavin and Lydia before close of business today. You'll pull your real estate agent off the listing, and you will remove yourself from their lives entirely. You take your $50,000. You go find yourself a quiet condominium somewhere, and you stop dragging my daughter's name through the dirt. It's a generous offer for someone in your position." I studied the check. $50,000 to a man like Roland was pocket change. It was a simple hush money payment, something to tuck a problem away and protect his polished country club standing. He actually believed he could buy his way clear of the consequences. He believed that because he had money, he automatically had authority over me. I didn't touch the check. Instead, I reached into the inside pocket of my own jacket and produced a neatly folded document. I set it on the table beside his check. "I don't want your money, Roland," I said, keeping my voice quiet and even. "And even if I did, there isn't enough money in the world to buy that house. But since you're so deeply concerned about your family name, I'd suggest you read what I've just put in front of you." Roland frowned. He glanced at the folded paper, then back at me, visibly irritated that his financial gesture hadn't immediately resolved the matter. He reached out and opened it. It was a copy of the official police report drafted by my attorney, Elliot Vane. Attached behind it was a photocopy of the forged 5-year lease Lydia had presented to county sheriff's deputies that morning. I watched Roland's eyes move across the first page. His expression started at annoyance, but somewhere on the second page I could see the precise moment. The full weight of what he was reading punched through his armored composure. The color drained steadily from his face. The rigid bearing of a powerful CEO dissolved in real time, replaced by the hollow, frightened posture of a man watching the ground drop out beneath him. "Let me walk you through exactly what you're looking at," I said, keeping every trace of emotion out of my voice. "Yesterday morning, your daughter realized she had no legal claim to that house. Rather than pack her things, she chose to produce a fraudulent 5-year lease and present it to sworn law enforcement officers in order to block a legal property sale. That is felony title fraud, but the signature wasn't even the worst of it." I pressed my finger directly onto the photocopied notary stamp at the bottom of the page. "I ran a background check on that specific notary identification number," I continued. "It belongs to Nora Kellum. She is a senior paralegal who works entirely out of your corporate headquarters. Your daughter used your company's own resources to commit a federal crime." Roland stared at the stamp, his breathing going shallow and uneven. He understood exactly what this meant. I had done my homework on his logistics empire. His company depended heavily on enormous multi-million-dollar shipping contracts with the federal government. Those contracts demanded spotless corporate compliance. They required rigorous security clearances and an unblemished legal record. The very last thing a government contractor can ever afford is a federal fraud investigation traced back to their own offices. "You need to grasp the scale of what Lydia has done," I told him, leaning in. "My attorney has already filed formal charges with the district attorney. The fraud division is currently drafting subpoenas. They are going to look directly at Nora Kellum. They will pull her corporate computers, her emails, and her phone records to determine exactly how and when your daughter instructed her to falsify a legal document. And when the federal auditors see that a felony was executed using your corporate seal, they will freeze your government contracts and open a full investigation." Roland tried to speak, but the words stalled in his throat. He looked like a man who had just been pushed out of a plane with no parachute. He understood now that Lydia hadn't simply wrecked her own life to hold onto a house. In her frantic, entitled panic, she had carelessly dragged his entire logistics empire into the middle of a criminal conspiracy. "You cannot do this," Roland finally whispered, every trace of his earlier authority completely gone. "If the district attorney launches a corporate investigation, my board will panic. The government will pull our shipping licenses. It will demolish everything I have spent my life building." He told me to call my lawyer and pull the complaint. "I cannot withdraw a felony complaint once it's in the hands of the authorities," I replied, my voice flat and cold. "And even if I could, I wouldn't. You walked in here ready to throw money at me to shield your reputation. You raised a daughter who believes she can forge documents and steal property whenever she wants, because Daddy will always buy her a way out. Well, the bill has finally come due." Roland looked down at the $50,000 check sitting on the table. The sum that had seemed so commanding and overwhelming just 5 minutes ago now looked utterly insignificant against the corporate destruction bearing down on him. His hands were visibly shaking. He reached out, took his own certified check, and tore it slowly in half. Then he tore those halves into quarters, letting the pieces drift uselessly onto the Formica table. He rose from the booth. He said nothing more to me. He snatched his expensive leather briefcase, his knuckles blanching around the handle. He shoved through the glass door with a frantic, driven energy. He was no longer a proud father trying to spare his daughter an embarrassing eviction. He was a panicked CEO racing back to his corporate headquarters to brace himself for a catastrophic legal blow. Gavin and Lydia had believed they had powerful allies behind them, but they were now completely on their own. I was at my home office desk the morning after my encounter with Roland. The house was still, and the early sun came through the blinds in long, parallel lines across the mahogany surface. Across the city, inside a gleaming glass corporate tower, my son Gavin was almost certainly experiencing the polar opposite of calm. He was a man being compressed inside a rapidly shrinking box. With the house gutted, the utilities cut off, and his father-in-law now fully informed of his spectacular failure, Gavin had nowhere left to turn. He needed an urgent injection of cash to stop the bleeding money to cover the steep utility deposits higher movers and somehow keep Lydia from uncovering the true depth of his financial wreckage. Gavin held a vice president of sales title at a mid-sized software technology firm. The role came with a solid salary, strong benefits, and a healthy corporate retirement account. I knew for a fact that his personal checking accounts were empty and his personal credit was in ruins. His only remaining financial lifeline was that company retirement fund. I could picture him clearly sitting in his expensive ergonomic chair, sweating through his tailored shirt as he hammered frantically at the human resources portal. He was almost certainly trying to pull a hardship loan against his retirement savings, mortgaging his entire future just to make it through the week. But Gavin carried a crippling and absolute blind spot about himself. He moved through that corporate office as though he were a self-made titan of industry. He loved holding court with colleagues about his luxury cars, his sprawling suburban estate, and his connections to high society. He conveniently forgot the actual foundation his career had been built on. He had erased the real story of how he got there. 10 years ago, that software firm was a struggling startup, crammed into leased office space running on fumes. The founders were gifted developers, but the money had run out and bankruptcy was closing in. Gavin was an entry-level salesman, terrified his job was about to disappear. He came to me, hat in hand, asking for help. I reviewed their business model and decided to take a calculated risk. My company, Apex Holdings, injected a significant round of seed funding into the startup and kept it alive. That investment not only saved the company, it vaulted Gavin from a replaceable junior employee to a protected figure. The founders elevated him purely because he was the son of the man who had rescued them. I opened my heavy leather address book and found the direct line for the chief executive officer of the software firm. His name was Alec. Over the decades since Alec and I had maintained a relationship built on mutual respect. He ran the day-to-day operations, and I kept my distance, quietly receiving my quarterly dividends as the company expanded. I picked up the phone and dialed. Alec answered almost immediately, his voice easy and professional. He greeted me with enthusiasm, probably assuming I was calling about the upcoming quarterly earnings, or to acknowledge some recent product milestone. I let him wrap up his pleasantries before my tone shifted to straight business. I informed Alec that, as a primary seed investor and a major shareholder in his company, I was formally exercising my right to request an immediate targeted internal audit of the executive sales division. Alec sounded genuinely caught off guard. He asked whether there was something specific concerning me, assuring me that their overall revenue numbers were exceptionally strong. I told him my concern wasn't with incoming revenue, but with outgoing executive expenditures. I directed him specifically to pull the corporate expense reports for his vice president of sales, my own son, covering the past 24 months. I asked Alec to look very carefully at the line items filed under client entertainment and business travel. A long-waited silence fell on the other end of the line. Alec was a sharp man. He grasped immediately that a father doesn't call a CEO to order a financial audit on his own son, unless that father already knows precisely what the auditors are going to uncover. He assured me his chief financial officer would pull the records immediately and go through them before the lunch hour. I put the phone down and settled back in my chair. I already knew exactly what they were going to find because the picture of Gavin's real financial life had become impossible to ignore over the past several days. Gavin's legitimate salary simply wasn't enough to sustain Lydia and her bottomless appetite for luxury, even with me covering their housing. To keep the illusion intact, Gavin had been running his corporate expense account as a personal slush fund. Whenever Lydia wanted a romantic getaway, Gavin would book first-class flights to resort destinations and log the trips in the corporate system as out-of-state client acquisition meetings. When Lydia wanted to dazzle her country club circle with a lavish dinner at a 5-star restaurant, Gavin would run the tab through his corporate card and file it as client entertainment for prospective software buyers. He had been methodically siphoning thousands of dollars from his own employer to finance his wife's high society lifestyle, concealing the theft beneath layers of fabricated receipts and invented client names. He had grown so settled in his untouchable position as the investor's son that he was convinced no one would ever dare scrutinize his spending. Fewer than 2 hours later, my phone rang. It was Alec. The warmth was entirely gone from his voice. What replaced it was the clipped, rigid tone of a man managing serious corporate liability and barely holding back his anger. He told me the finance team had pulled the records exactly as I had requested. The discrepancies were massive, blatant, and completely indefensible. They had uncovered more than $40,000 in fraudulent charges, luxury spa treatments, imported, wine purchases, all filed under corporate team building and client outreach. Alec told me that at that very moment, Gavin was sitting at his desk, actively trying to push through a $50,000 loan against his retirement savings. But before Gavin could hit the final submission button, the human resources portal locked him out of the system entirely. The screen on his computer went blank. Seconds later, 2 corporate security guards and the director of human resources walked straight into his glass-enclosed office. They didn't give Gavin a moment to explain himself or reach his wife. They told him to stand and step away from his desk. They collected his corporate credit card, his building access badge, and his company-issued laptop. They informed him right in front of the entire sales floor that he was the subject of an active investigation for corporate theft and expense fraud. Given that the evidence was already overwhelming, they told him he was suspended immediately pending a formal termination hearing. Alec apologized to me on the phone, clearly anxious that I might pull my investment capital now that he'd had to discipline my son. I cut him off. I told Alec he was doing exactly what an ethical chief executive should do to protect his company. I assured him my investment would remain completely untouched and that I fully supported whatever legal and administrative steps he needed to take against a thief, regardless of our blood connection. I ended the call and looked out at the bright afternoon sky through my office window. Gavin had walked into that building that morning, desperately hoping to secure a loan and prop up his counterfeit suburban life. Instead, he was walked out through the lobby by security guards, his personal belongings packed into a small cardboard box. He had no company car. He had no access to his retirement funds. And most devastating of all, his substantial corporate salary was completely frozen. His income had dropped to absolute zero overnight, leaving him entirely exposed to the financial storm that was about to hit. Gavin returned to the dark, gutted house in a state of complete shock. He had just been escorted out of his well-paying corporate position by security guards, his income locked away. He dropped onto the leather sofa in the living room and stared blankly at the empty wall where their luxury television used to hang. He was utterly catatonic, paralyzed by the sudden total implosion of the life he had constructed. That left Lydia entirely alone to manage the disaster that was accelerating around her. Lydia was in full panic. They had no cash to cover the steep utility deposit needed to restore the power. They had no money for groceries. Roland, her wealthy father, was currently consumed by his own frantic efforts to shield his logistics empire from a federal fraud investigation. And he was furious with her. He was not going to send a single dollar her way. Lydia needed an immediate source of fast cash to get through the week, and she needed it before darkness fell again. She began moving through the dim hallways of the house, her mind clawing for any viable solution. She walked past the gutted kitchen and made her way to the door leading down to the basement. During the major renovation project I had foolishly funded, we had completely converted the basement into a high-end private suite. It had its own separate side entrance, a small kitchenette, and a beautifully tiled bathroom. Being below ground level, it was naturally insulated and noticeably cooler than the stifling heat pressing down on the upper floors. Lydia recognized it as the only part of the house that still held any practical value. She took out her cell phone and snapped several photographs of the suite. She angled each shot carefully to highlight the upscale finishes while keeping the lack of electricity out of frame. She immediately downloaded a well-known short-term vacation rental application. She created a brand new host profile and uploaded the edited photographs. She wrote a glowing description of a private, exclusive suburban retreat, conveniently omitting the fact that the property had no running water or municipal power. She priced the nightly rate absurdly high, banking on trapping a wealthy traveler or unsuspecting tourist who needed last-minute accommodations. She hit publish and sat back convinced she had just engineered a brilliant workaround to generate untraceable cash. I was sitting in my home office across town, entirely unaware of her specific scheme. But I was not leaving anything to chance. When I listed the property for sale, I had instructed my real estate broker to set up an automated digital alert tied to the property address across all major online platforms. It's a standard precaution to ensure no unauthorized party attempts to stake a claim on the listing. My computer chimed softly with a new notification. I opened the email and found a direct link to a short-term rental application. There, staring back at me from my screen, was a brand new listing for my own basement suite, hosted by Lydia. Lydia had grown up surrounded by wealth, but she had never taken the time to acquaint herself with the fine details of municipal law. The suburban neighborhood where my house sits falls within a highly exclusive, tightly regulated residential zoning district. Years ago, the local city council passed a strict ordinance entirely prohibiting all short-term commercial rentals. The measure was designed to prevent investors from converting quiet residential streets into a revolving door of tourists and late-night parties. Operating an unlicensed commercial rental in this particular neighborhood does not result in a polite letter from the homeowners association. It constitutes a serious municipal violation, one that carries an immediate maximum fine of $5,000 per occurrence, and legally reclassifies the entire property as an illegal commercial enterprise. I did not phone Lydia and tell her to pull the listing. I did not contact the local police. I picked up my phone and dialed a private investigative firm I had worked with for corporate background checks throughout my engineering career. I retained an experienced private investigator named Wade. I gave Wade clear and precise instructions. I told him to create a guest account on the rental application and book the basement suite for a single night immediately. I authorized him to use my corporate credit card and pay whatever inflated rate Lydia was asking without negotiating. I needed the digital paper trail of the transaction to be absolutely airtight. Within 10 minutes, Wade confirmed the booking was complete. Lydia accepted the reservation almost immediately. She was no doubt thrilled by the sudden money hitting her account, completely blind to the fact that she had just welcomed a licensed investigator hired by the very man she was trying to outmaneuver. She believed she was solving her cash problem, but she was actually sealing her own fate. Later that evening, as the sun started going down, Wade pulled up to the house in an unmarked vehicle. He had a discreet high-definition hidden camera clipped firmly to his jacket lapel. He walked up the driveway and met Lydia near the side gate. Lydia greeted him with a strained smile, holding a heavy-duty battery-powered lantern. She spun a transparent lie about a temporary neighborhood power grid failure, promising him the electricity would be back on shortly. She guided him down the side path and unlocked the basement entrance. She handed over the key and retreated upstairs quickly, eager to count her illegal earnings. Wade spent exactly 2 hours inside the basement suite. He did not sleep there. He conducted a thorough, methodical documentation process. He photographed the welcome manual Lydia had left on the bedside table in sharp detail. He captured video of the dark, unpowered bathroom. He assembled screenshots of the digital transaction, confirming the commercial exchange of money for lodging. He put together an airtight, unchallengeable portfolio, proving beyond any doubt that Lydia was actively running an unauthorized commercial operation on strictly residential property. First thing the following morning, Wade drove directly to the Municipal Code Enforcement Office. He didn't file an anonymous tip. He walked to the front desk and handed the chief inspector the complete physical portfolio of evidence. The inspector reviewed the digital receipts, the photographs, and the detailed incident report. Because the evidence was absolute and impossible to contest, city authorities bypassed their standard warning procedure. They issued an immediate maximum-level municipal code violation. Within the hour, a city enforcement officer arrived at the property and stapled a large, bright orange notice of illegal commercial activity directly onto the front door of the house. The steep fine attached to that orange paper was staggering, but the fine itself was entirely beside the point of my broader strategy. The true devastating power of that orange notice was entirely legal. Wade sent a scanned copy of the official city violation straight to my email. I forwarded it without hesitation to my corporate attorney, Elliot Vane. Elliot called me back inside 5 minutes, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of professional satisfaction. Lydia had already produced a forged 5-year lease, banking on the sluggish machinery of housing court to drag out the residential eviction process for months. But by illegally renting out that basement for fast cash, she had permanently shifted the legal classification of the entire dispute. Elliot laid it out plainly under our state's property laws. Documented illegal commercial activity on a residential premise automatically and irrevocably voids any existing residential lease, genuine or forged. It strips the occupants of every standard tenant protection they would otherwise hold. Because Lydia had converted the house into an unlicensed commercial operation, Elliot now had the full legal authority to walk right past housing court entirely. He told me he was heading straight into a judge's chambers to file an emergency commercial detainer. Lydia believed her fast thinking had preserved her comfortable life, but she had just handed my attorney the precise, airtight legal instrument needed to execute an emergency 48-hour eviction. The final countdown on their counterfeit suburban kingdom had officially begun. That 48-hour emergency commercial eviction clock ran out at exactly 9 in the morning. I parked at the far end of the suburban cul-de-sac and covered the remaining distance to the property on foot. I took my position on the public sidewalk across the street shoulder against a broad oak tree. I needed to see this chapter reach its absolute end. The neighborhood sat quiet, completely oblivious to the legal guillotine descending toward that front door. Precisely at 9:15, a White County Sheriff's cruiser turned onto the street and pulled directly into the driveway. 2 deputies climbed out. They were heavy-set men in tactical vests carrying thick metal clipboards. Nothing about them suggested they were there to discuss options. They moved up the stone walkway I had paid for not giving a second glance to the gutted, empty kitchen visible through the front windows. The lead deputy drove his fist against the front door. The knock rolled down the street. It took over a minute before anyone answered. Gavin appeared in the entryway. He looked like a man who had already lost. He hadn't shaved in days, and he had on the very same wrinkled shirt he'd been wearing the afternoon the appliances were hauled away. The lead deputy skipped any pleasantry. He simply raised the clipboard, displaying the emergency commercial detainer bearing a municipal judge's signature. He informed Gavin that because the property had been actively operated as an illegal, unlicensed hotel business, all residential tenant rights were completely extinguished. They had exactly 20 minutes to collect whatever personal belongings they could carry and vacate immediately. Gavin tried to push back. He stammered, insisted there had been a mistake, kept claiming they needed at least 30 days under state law. The deputy cut him off cold. He explained that a judge had already reviewed the private investigator reports, the financial receipts, and the municipal code violations. The ruling was final. The deputy let his hand rest on his utility belt and ordered Gavin to step aside. The two officers walked straight into the house, their heavy boots striking hard against the floors. I watched through those wide front windows as pure panic ignited inside. Lydia came flying down the stairs from the master bedroom, screaming hysterically, demanding to know what was going on. The deputies paid her no attention. They simply pointed at the clock on the wall and told her the 20-minute countdown was already running. Because they had no money to hire movers and no time to source boxes, Gavin and Lydia fell back on the only packing materials still left in the house, heavy-duty black plastic trash bags. I watched my son, a man who days earlier had posed as a polished corporate executive, frantically cramming his custom-tailored suits and expensive leather shoes into garbage bags. Lydia was circling the living room, hurling designer handbags and cosmetics into another plastic sack, sobbing without restraint. The illusion of their high society existence was literally being bagged up like refuse. With only 10 minutes left on the clock, Lydia realized they had absolutely nowhere to take those bags. No hotel reservation, their credit cards were maxed and frozen. No friends willing to take them in, not after the humiliating appliance repossession the entire neighborhood had witnessed. In a state of complete desperation, she pulled her cell phone from her pocket and dialed the one person left on Earth with the financial power to pull them back from the edge, her wealthy father, Roland. She put the call on speaker, her hands trembling badly. Even from across the street, the stillness of the summer air carried the faint, frantic pitch of her voice drifting out through the open front door. She begged her father to send a car. She pleaded with him to let them move into the sprawling guest house on his private estate. She promised it would only be a few weeks, just until Gavin landed something new. Roland offered no comfort whatsoever. His voice came through that phone speaker like a blade. He wasn't calling from his immaculate corner office. He was in a sterile conference room, surrounded by corporate defense attorneys. He informed his daughter in cold, flat terms that federal investigators had raided Roland's International Logistics Company's headquarters at 6:00 in the morning. They had arrived bearing a grand jury subpoena, demanding every email communication and hard drive belonging to Nora Kellum, the paralegal Lydia had illegally used to stamp her forged lease. Roland told Lydia that federal auditors had officially frozen 3 of his most profitable government shipping contracts pending a full criminal review. His board of directors was calling for his immediate resignation. His entire logistics empire was hemorrhaging millions of dollars by the hour, all because she had chosen to commit felony title fraud to hold on to a suburban house she had never even owned. Lydia broke down harder, begging him to just listen, pleading with him to understand that she was moments away from being homeless. Roland stopped her mid-sentence. His corporate attorneys had explicitly directed him to sever all contact with her immediately to avoid being drawn in as a co-conspirator in her federal crimes. He told his own daughter she was a massive liability. Then, without a moment's pause, he ended the call. The line went dead. Roland had cut the final rope. The lead deputy checked his watch and announced the 20 minutes were finished. He gestured toward the front door. Gavin and Lydia lunged for more bags, but the deputies physically stepped between them and what remained. They were told they could reach out to the property manager later to arrange a supervised retrieval of the rest of their belongings, but their physical presence inside that house was no longer legally permitted. Gavin hauled 3 bulging black trash bags out onto the front porch. Lydia came behind him, clutching a single plastic sack stuffed with her jewelry and makeup, her face streaked with tears and ruined mascara. The deputies walked them down the steps and held their position at the edge of the property line, making certain neither of them attempted to turn back. Just as Gavin dropped those garbage bags onto the concrete driveway, a small white commercial van pulled up to the curb alongside my car. A man in a blue work shirt climbed out carrying a heavy metal toolbox. He was the commercial locksmith I had hired the day before. He walked straight past Gavin and Lydia, without so much as a glance in their direction, went directly to the front door, pulled a heavy drill from his toolbox, and began destroying the deadbolts. The high-pitched whine of the drill biting into the metal locks carried through the quiet neighborhood. Gavin and Lydia stood on the hot asphalt of the driveway, completely locked out of the property they had been claiming as their own just 48 hours earlier. They watched the brass hardware fall to the porch, immediately replaced by brand-new heavy-duty commercial cylinders. They had nothing left. The house was legally secured against them. Their utilities were cut. Gavin had no job and no income. Lydia was staring down serious felony charges that had just cost her the one powerful ally she had left. They stood there surrounded by black garbage bags full of wrinkled designer clothes, looking at a house they would never walk into again, completely stranded, entirely broke, and utterly alone on the sidewalk. The neighborhood's silence settled over them as the locksmith placed the single set of new gleaming keys in my hand. The eviction was absolute, but the consequences of their arrogance were far from finished. The neon sign outside the Crossroads Motor Inn flickered with a dull, buzzing hum. It was a cheap roadside establishment, parked right next to the thunder of the interstate. This was the absolute bottom. It was the only place Gavin and Lydia could afford, for the night paid for with the small reserve of emergency cash Lydia had tucked away in her purse. The gap between that dingy room and the multi-million-dollar suburban estate they had been occupying just 24 hours earlier was almost incomprehensible. They spent the night on a lumpy mattress that carried the faint odor of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. What remained of their personal belongings was still crammed inside those heavy-duty black garbage bags heaped in the corner of the stained carpet. They were bone-tired, but sleep offered no refuge. At 7:00 in the morning, the harsh growl of heavy diesel engines tore through the quiet of the motel parking lot. It was followed by the loud clanking of thick metal chains and the mechanical whine of hydraulic lifts. Gavin jolted awake. He rolled off the mattress and lurched toward the small window. He yanked back the faded curtain and peered out through the dusty glass. What he found in that parking lot drained every last trace of color from his face. Parked squarely behind his sleek black, leased luxury sedan was a massive commercial tow truck. A second flatbed was maneuvering into position alongside Lydia's pristine, white luxury sport utility vehicle. These two cars were the ultimate physical proof of the wealthy life they had constructed from nothing. Gavin loved to rev that sedan's engine pulling into the country club. Lydia treated her enormous vehicle like a rolling throne when she cruised through the suburban neighborhoods. Now, two men in greasy work shirts were wrapping heavy steel cables around the axles of those expensive toys. Gavin couldn't grasp how this was moving so quickly. He assumed that because he had made the monthly lease payment just a few weeks prior, both cars were safely beyond the reach of his current financial collapse. But Gavin had a long history of ignoring the fundamental details of his own financial architecture. 3 years ago, when Gavin walked into the high-end luxury car dealership, he was already drowning in concealed credit card debt. The dealership's finance department ran his credit score and rejected his lease application on the spot. They told him he was far too great a financial risk to drive away in two vehicles worth more than $150,000 combined. Gavin had come to me on his knees. He begged me to co-sign the lease agreements. I agreed, but I didn't stop at co-signing. Because my corporate credit rating was absolutely pristine, I was listed as the primary financial guarantor on both leases. My personal and corporate assets were the sole reason that luxury car dealership ever handed him those keys. The lease contract carried a very standard but very strict financial security clause. It required the primary driver to maintain verified active employment and a steady minimum income, ensuring the vehicles wouldn't become a liability to the dealership. The afternoon before, right after the chief executive officer of the software technology firm suspended Gavin and froze his salary, I made one phone call. I reached the executive finance director at the luxury car dealership. I informed them that the primary driver of both leased vehicles had just been suspended without pay pending a large-scale corporate theft investigation. I formally withdrew my standing as financial guarantor, citing a material and catastrophic change in the leaseholder's employment status. Without my corporate backing and with Gavin's income sitting at absolute zero, the dealership immediately flagged both vehicles as critical flight risks. They didn't wait for a missed payment. They triggered an emergency repossession clause and sent the recovery trucks out before the sun had cleared the horizon. Gavin burst through the motel room door, barefoot on the hot, cracked asphalt, wearing nothing but a pair of wrinkled dress slacks and a white undershirt. He ran across the parking lot screaming at the tow operators to stop. He waved his arms wildly, demanding they unhook the cables from his sedan. He tried to puff himself up, projecting the authority of a corporate vice president, insisting there had been some enormous administrative error. The lead tow operator was a large man holding an electronic clipboard. He had no interest in Gavin or his screaming. He was a professional who handled frantic, desperate people every day of his working life. He calmly tapped the screen of his clipboard and informed Gavin that the dealership had issued an immediate recall order on both vehicle identification numbers. He made clear that the only way to halt the physical removal of those cars was to settle the full remaining balance on both leases right there on the spot, overnight dispatch and repossession fees included. Gavin actually thought he could buy his way out. He was running on blind panic and the stubborn delusion that his card still held power. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his leather wallet. He grabbed his Premier Gold credit card. He thrust it at the tow operator, telling him to charge whatever was needed to put those cars back on the pavement. The operator pulled a small mobile card reader from his utility belt. He synced it to his tablet and ran the card. The machine processed for 3 seconds before letting out a sharp, flat beep. The screen flashed a bright red declined message. Gavin shook his head frantically, telling the operator to run it again, insisting it was just a daily limit restriction. He dug a second card from his wallet. It was a platinum travel card. He shoved it into the reader. The machine beeped again. Declined. Gavin began to physically shake. He pulled out a third card, then a fourth. He ran every single piece of plastic he had on him. Every single one came back declined. The banks had already been alerted to his corporate suspension and his catastrophic debt-to-income ratio. Their systems had locked his accounts entirely to stop him from piling further massive charges onto dead credit. His lines of credit were completely finished. Lydia stood in the open doorway of the motel room. She watched in absolute horror as her husband failed entirely to protect the last assets they had. She watched the hydraulic lift engage and hoist the front wheels of her pristine white sport utility vehicle off the ground. She watched the winch drag Gavin's beloved black sedan up onto the tilted flatbed of the second truck. She understood in that exact moment that they weren't simply homeless anymore. They had been stripped of their mobility as well. The tow operator handed Gavin a printed repossession receipt. No sympathy was offered. He simply turned, climbed back into his cab, and fired up the engine. Gavin stood frozen on the asphalt, watching both commercial vehicles nose out of the motel parking lot and merge onto the roaring interstate. They carried away the very last physical remnants of his manufactured high society existence. He was left standing in the dust and exhaust fumes. The morning sun pressed down on his bare feet. He looked at the handful of useless plastic cards scattered across the ground around him. He looked over at Lydia, who was staring back at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. They had no house to go back to. They had no jobs producing income. They had no wealthy relatives willing to pick up the phone. And now, they had absolutely no vehicles to drive. They were completely stranded at a cheap roadside motel on the outskirts of the city, rendered entirely immobile by the devastating weight of their own arrogance. The glass doors of Elliot Vane's office building in downtown Nashville slid open with a soft, mechanical whisper. I was seated in the main conference room with my attorney Elliot Vane. The room was built to intimidate. It featured a massive polished mahogany table, heavy leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. It was an environment of absolute corporate authority. At exactly 10 hours in the morning, the receptionist brought Gavin and Lydia into the room. They looked utterly destroyed. Every hour of the past 3 days was etched plainly across their faces. Gavin was still in the same dress pants from the morning of the eviction, now deeply wrinkled and stained from hours on the dusty asphalt of that motel parking lot. Lydia looked completely hollowed out. Her designer clothes were rumpled and tired. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and her eyes were swollen and red from crying through the night after watching her luxury vehicle disappear on the back of a tow truck. They settled into the chairs on the opposite side of that wide table. Neither of them looked at me. They fixed their eyes on the polished wood surface, every trace of their former arrogance gone. Elliot didn't offer them anything to drink. He skipped all pleasantries. He opened a thick manila folder and began laying out the full reality of their situation with surgical precision. Elliot explained that the district attorney was actively reviewing the felony title fraud case surrounding the forged lease. He informed Lydia that her father, Roland, had officially retained a team of federal defense attorneys who were actively working alongside the authorities. Roland had cut himself off from her entirely, leaving her exposed to protect his logistics empire. She was completely alone, staring down the very real, terrifying possibility of a federal prison sentence. Lydia began to shake. She wrapped both arms around herself, eyes wide and wild with fear, as she looked across at Elliot. It hit her all at once. The wealth and connections she had leaned on her entire life were simply gone. Elliot then slid a thick legal document across the broad mahogany table and set a heavy silver pen directly on top of it. He told them that I was prepared to intervene with the district attorney. I was willing to push for the criminal charges to be reduced to a minor misdemeanor with no jail time, but only if they agreed to a brutal non-negotiable settlement right there and right then. Elliot laid out the terms without flinching. First, they were required to sign a sworn public affidavit acknowledging the forgery and title fraud, permanently clearing my company of any wrongdoing. Second, and far more devastating, Gavin was required to sign an irrevocable waiver of inheritance. He had to legally renounce every future claim to my estate, my corporate holdings, and my personal trusts, legally cutting himself off forever. The document stated plainly that upon my death, Gavin would receive absolutely nothing, and any attempt to contest my will in probate court would be dismissed with prejudice automatically. Gavin stared at the document like it was something that might bite him. The color drained clean out of his face. He grasped that I wasn't merely stripping away the counterfeit lifestyle he'd been living. I was methodically severing his connection to my wealth for the rest of his life. The safety net he had always assumed would catch him when I eventually died was being shredded for good. He lifted his eyes from the page and looked straight at me. His corporate intimidation tactics were worthless here, and he knew it. His financial bullying had collapsed. So he fell back on the lowest, most manipulative move a son can make. He tried to weaponize the memory of his dead mother against me. Gavin leaned in, voice trembling, forcing tears into his eyes. He asked how I could possibly do this to my own flesh and blood. He brought up my late wife, claiming she would be absolutely horrified if she were seated in that room right now. He insisted she always wanted the family to hold together no matter what. He tried to paint a portrait of a forgiving mother who never held his childhood mistakes over him, and said I was dishonoring her memory by making him sign away his birthright. I never broke eye contact. The air in that conference room turned to ice. I looked straight through his manufactured tears. I told him to never put his mother's name in his mouth in front of me again. I reminded him of the last 6 months of her life when she was confined to a hospice bed and slowly slipping away. I reminded him that I was by her side every single day, while he was always too occupied networking at the country club, taking Lydia on luxury getaways to come sit with her. I told him his mother loved the innocent boy he once was, but she would be utterly disgusted by the greedy, entitled parasite sitting across from me at that table. I told him that protecting the wealth she helped me build from a son who tried to destroy everything we created was the greatest honor I could give her memory. Gavin sank back into his leather chair, entirely deflated. His last emotional weapon had shattered against a wall of cold, unvarnished truth. He glanced at Lydia, grasping for some scrap of defiance. He shook his head and told her they shouldn't sign anything. He said they could find a public defender, fight the charges in court, and wait me out until I backed down. He told her he was not about to sign away millions in future inheritance just to make a legal problem disappear. He still believed his eventual access to my money outweighed everything else. But Lydia wasn't thinking about the inheritance. She was thinking about a concrete cell, a metal toilet, and a federal criminal record. She turned and stared at Gavin with an expression of pure, unfiltered disbelief and hatred. She understood in that precise moment that her husband was entirely willing to gamble with her freedom, to let her rot in a federal penitentiary, all to protect a hypothetical inheritance he felt owed to him. Something inside Lydia snapped completely. She stopped consulting him. She didn't ask for his permission. She lunged forward across the table and seized the heavy silver pen. Gavin reached out to stop her shouting her name, but she slapped his hand away with force. Her voice cut across the conference room, bouncing off the glass walls. She told him he was a pathetic broke loser, and she was absolutely not going to federal prison for a man who couldn't even afford a rental car to drive them out of their cheap motel. Without another moment's hesitation, Lydia flipped to the signature page of the settlement. She signed her name on the public admission of fraud, her hand trembling with pure adrenaline and rage. Then she shoved the document violently across the table until it struck Gavin square in the chest. She pointed the silver pen directly at his face. She demanded he sign his portion immediately. She told him that if he refused to sign the waiver and disinherit himself right then, she would personally walk down to the district attorney's office and testify that the entire forgery scheme was his idea from the start. She was throwing him completely under the bus to save herself. Gavin sat frozen, staring at his furious wife. The unified front they had always shown the world was utterly destroyed. Their marriage built on a foundation of stolen money, fabricated status, and my bank accounts fractured violently right there in that boardroom. Gavin picked up the pen. With a shaking hand and a broken spirit, he signed his name on the dotted line, officially erasing himself from my legacy forever. Exactly 7 days after the county sheriff's office cleared the property, the house sat in complete silence. I stood alone in the center of the living room, where my son Gavin used to hold court for his wealthy in-laws. The space was entirely empty now. The solid thud of my leather shoes echoed off bare walls and the wide plank white oak floors. The imported quartzite countertops in the kitchen looked cold and stark without the appliances the contractor had come to repossess. It was no longer a stage set dressed to impress high society. It was just an empty shell of wood and stone stripped of every last inch of its manufactured prestige. I crossed to the large front window and looked out at the street. The heavy commercial deadbolts the locksmith had installed kept the past firmly where it belonged. I was waiting for my real estate broker Dorian to arrive with a prospective buyer. A modest sedan pulled into the driveway, parking right where Gavin used to park his least expensive luxury car. Dorian climbed out, followed by a young couple. They didn't look anything like the typical buyers who circled this exclusive suburban neighborhood. No designer clothes, no expensive watches on their wrists. The young man wore a worn canvas work shirt and heavy steel-toed boots. The young woman had on simple slacks and carried a well-worn leather tote bag. They came up the front steps with a quiet, respectful hesitation. I opened the door and let them in. Dorian introduced them as Owen and Hazel. Owen extended his hand. His grip was solid and his palms were thick with calluses. I knew those hands the instant I felt them. They belonged to a man who worked for a living, who built things from the ground up, and understood the real value of a dollar. Hazel smiled warmly, her eyes moving over the structural details of the foyer rather than drifting up to the chandelier. They moved through the empty rooms with genuine appreciation. Not one complaint about the missing appliances or the bare floors. Owen pointed out the solid craftsmanship of the baseboards and the sturdy framing around the windows. He understood the bones of the place. Watching them walk through the kitchen sent the sudden vivid memory rushing through me. 40 years ago, my late wife and I walked through our very first starter home. We had nothing but a modest savings account and an enormous amount of determination. We worked double shifts to cover the mortgage. We painted our own walls and fixed our own plumbing. We built our life block by block with absolute integrity. Gavin never understood that kind of grit. He came into the world after my engineering firm had already found its footing. He grew up in a comfortable house with a full refrigerator and a college tuition that was paid before he ever set foot on campus. He treated wealth as an automatic birthright rather than something earned through relentless effort. He expected the keys to a kingdom handed to him without a single day's work on his part. Owen and Hazel were the exact opposite of that. They were the kind of people Gavin used to look down on. After the walkthrough wrapped up, they gathered in the living room with Dorian. Hazel glanced at Owen with a mix of hope and quiet anxiety. Owen turned to face me and spoke with complete unvarnished honesty. No negotiation games, no posturing. He told me they loved the house and could genuinely picture raising a family within these walls. He explained that they ran a small independent landscaping business they had spent the last 5 years building from nothing. They had recently sold off a large portion of their commercial contracts and liquidated everything they had to finally put themselves in a position to buy a home in a safe neighborhood. But then Owen looked me straight in the eye and laid out their problem plainly. Their absolute ceiling was $40,000 below my asking price. He didn't ask for a handout. He didn't try to work me with a sob story. He simply presented his financial reality with quiet dignity. He said their income from the business fluctuated too much for the big banks to approve them for a traditional mortgage to cover the gap. But he was offering me everything they had in clean liquid cash. No bank approvals, no financing contingencies, no drawn-out waiting periods. A straightforward cash transfer wired directly into my corporate accounts. Dorian, my real estate broker, wasted no time pulling me aside. He lowered his voice and told me we should walk away from the offer entirely. He pointed out that the market was red hot, and if we left the sign in the yard another 2 weeks, we could easily land the full price or ignite a bidding war among buyers with deeper pockets. Strictly speaking, Dorian was right. Taking their lower number meant leaving real money behind, but Dorian didn't grasp what this transaction was actually about. This house was never really about the money. It was a physical monument to my son's entitlement, the fortress he used to try to cut me out of my grandson's life. Gavin had always believed that no matter how badly things went, this property would come back to him eventually. He assumed I would soften with time, forgive him, and hand him the keys again. He believed his bloodline guaranteed his claim. I turned away from Dorian and walked back to Owen and Hazel. I looked at the calluses on Owen's hands and the honest, hopeful look on Hazel's face. I understood then that the greatest act of justice I could deliver wasn't simply forcing Gavin out. It was taking the very asset he felt entitled to and placing it directly in the hands of people who had actually earned it. I wanted this house to belong to someone who knew what hard work meant. I reached out and offered Owen my hand. I told him I would accept the lower offer on one condition. We would skip the standard 30-day escrow entirely and close the whole transaction in exactly 5 days. I wanted the deed transferred, the cash wired, and the legal ownership permanently cut before the week was out. Owen stared at me for just a fraction of a second before a wide smile broke across his face. He grabbed my hand and shook it hard, agreeing without a moment's hesitation. Hazel brought both hands to her mouth, eyes filling with tears of genuine gratitude. They had just secured the home they had worked toward for years, and I had just locked in the absolute finality of everything I had set in motion. 5 days later, I was seated in the spare conference room of a local title company. The air conditioning hummed in the background while a clerk worked through thick stacks of closing documents. Owen and Hazel sat across from me, signing their way through a mountain of legal paperwork with eager, trembling hands. Every signature they put on those pages drove another nail into the coffin of my son's fabricated life. The title agent stamped the final page and slid it across the heavy wooden desk. I picked up the pen and signed my name, releasing the deed from my corporate holdings for good. My phone buzzed in my pocket, an automated alert from my bank confirming a substantial inbound wire transfer of pure cash. The transaction was complete. The house was officially gone. The ground Gavin used to stand on when he demanded I keep away from my family was now permanently in the hands of strangers. No path back, no chance of reconciliation, and absolutely nothing left for him to inherit. A full year has gone by since the morning those heavy commercial deadbolts locked my son out of his manufactured suburban kingdom. Today the air smells entirely different. I'm not standing on hot asphalt surrounded by garbage bags and repossession trucks. I'm seated in the front row of a vast steel auditorium, a converted airplane hangar attached to the State Aviation Mechanic Academy. The air carries a faint trace of aviation fuel and polished concrete. It's the smell of honest labor and real tangible skill. The metal folding chair under me isn't luxurious, but it feels better than every piece of expensive leather seating I've ever occupied in a 5-star restaurant. Around me sit proud working-class families who gave everything to see their children succeed. No rehearsed society smiles. No wealthy father-in-law sizing up the cut of my suit. Just genuine, unpretentious pride. The Academy's dean steps up to the wooden podium. He adjusts the microphone and works through the names of the graduating class. I lean forward, resting my hands on my knees. When he calls Cooper's name, something swells deep in my chest, a profound, absolute sense of triumph. My grandson crosses the wide wooden stage. He isn't dressed in an expensive designer suit. He's wearing the crisp uniform of a certified aviation mechanic. He carries himself tall shoulders, broad and squared with confidence. He spent the last 12 months tearing down complex turbine engines and rebuilding them from scratch with his own hands. He finished at the very top of his class, earning the highest technical certification the Academy has to offer. He takes his diploma with a firm handshake, holding eye contact with each of his instructors with complete respect. I glance at the empty folding chairs on either side of me. Gavin and Lydia are not here to see their son's greatest achievement. They aren't even in the same city. The crushing weight of real poverty tore their marriage apart just weeks after the eviction. The moment the money disappeared, the thin shell of what they had together cracked open. They spent their final weeks under the same roof in a cheap apartment, screaming at each other and pointing fingers over who was to blame for everything that had collapsed. Their divorce was finalized 6 months ago. Bitter, fiercely contested, and ultimately a fight over an empty bank account and a mountain of toxic debt. Gavin now rents a single small room above a loud commercial laundry facility. He works an entry-level customer service job at a regional call center. The man who once bragged about corporate expense accounts and a rotation of luxury vehicles now spends 8 hours a day in a cheap headset, absorbing the anger of customers upset over minor billing errors. His wages are heavily garnished to chip away at the personal loans and credit card balances he ran up, while performing wealth for his in-laws. He rides a city bus to work every morning because a down payment on a used car is still out of reach. The corporate world closed its doors to him completely after the theft investigation, and an executive title is something he will never hold again. Lydia's fall was equally devastating. To stay out of a federal penitentiary for the title fraud and the forged notary stamp, she accepted a punishing plea deal. She is currently serving 3 years of strict federal probation. Her father, Roland, cut her off completely to shield his logistics empire from a government audit. He won't take her calls and has legally barred her from his private estate. The country club circle that used to drain her imported wine abandoned her the instant her name showed up in the local police blotter. She now works part-time as a cashier at a discount retail store on the far side of the state, scanning cheap merchandise day after day to slowly work down her court fines. The high society life she built around herself is nothing more than a painful fading memory. Cooper descends the wooden stairs of the stage diploma in hand. He catches sight of me in the front row, and a wide, genuine smile spreads across his face. He cuts straight toward me, moving past the rest of the crowd without a second glance. He doesn't care that I'm an older man in a plain button-down shirt. He pulls me into a firm embrace, thanking me for believing in him when his own parents were trying to push him into a life he never wanted. He tells me he just received a formal job offer from a major commercial airline, a junior structural mechanic position at their primary regional hub. His future is completely secure, and every inch of it was built on his own merit. I tell him how deeply proud I am of the man standing in front of me. I reach into the inner pocket of my jacket. This time, I'm not pulling out a velvet jewelry box. I pull out a heavy brass keyring with 2 shiny metal keys on it. I set the keys directly into the palm of his hand and fold his fingers around them. He looks down, then back up at me, brow creased with confusion. He asks what the keys are for. I explain that they belong to a modest 3-bedroom starter home, located just 15 minutes from the airline hub where he'll be working. The house has a sturdy roof, a solid foundation, and a large detached garage where he can work on his own projects. I didn't buy it in my name, and I certainly didn't buy it in his father's name. I purchased the property entirely in cash through a heavily fortified, irrevocable trust fund. I walk him through the full legal security of the arrangement. Cooper is the sole beneficiary and the primary resident. The house belongs entirely to him, wrapped in a fortress of corporate law. I tell him that Gavin can never set foot on the property. Gavin can never use the house as collateral for a loan. Gavin can never claim a single dime of its value, and he can never attempt to move himself in and feed off his son's hard work. The legal walls are absolute and completely impenetrable. The cycle of entitlement, financial exploitation, and generational manipulation ends here permanently. Cooper stares at the keys resting in his palm, eyes filling with tears of real gratitude. He understands that he is stepping into his adult life entirely debt-free with a roof over his head that no one can ever strip away from him. He feels the full weight of the protection I have built around him. We walk out of the Aviation Academy together, side by side, pushing through the wide metal doors and out into the bright, warm afternoon sun. The air is clean, and the road ahead is a completely open slate. I guided my grandson away from the toxic, rotting foundation his parents built their lives on. I have fully shielded what I worked for from the people who tried to bleed me dry. I step away from that auditorium feeling lighter than I have in years. My assets are secure. If you have stayed with me this far, then you already know this story was never really about money. It was about what a man owes the people he loves and what he owes himself when those people betray that love without a moment of remorse. Looking back, I will not pretend it did not cost me anything. Watching a son, I choose greed over decency, and watching a grandson nearly get buried under the weight of his parents' ambition. That kind of pain does not just disappear when the paperwork is signed. But I believe God does not waste suffering. The Lord's timing put Cooper in that aviation academy, put Owen and Hazel in that house, and put me in that front row seat at graduation. None of that happens if I fold when the pressure was highest. If this family revenge story has taught me anything worth passing on, it is this. First, document everything before you act. Emotion is not leverage evidences. Second, the most powerful thing you can give a young person is a foundation nobody can mortgage out from under them. Third, when someone shows you they value your money more than your presence, believe them the first time. Fourth, real protection is not revenge. It is removing the predator's access entirely and rebuilding around what is good. For every adult 50 plus, man or woman out there carrying a story, like this one wondering if they are wrong for finally drawing a hard line, you are not wrong. This family revenge story is proof that patience, documentation, and quiet resolve will outlast every scheme built on entitlement. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and tell me what moment hit you hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear that standing firm is not cruelty, it is wisdom. And if you are not already with us, subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories. There is more where this came from. Thank you for being here, take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next one.